He says he loves you, but you still feel alone. If that hits home, you might be stuck in a toxic love loop with an emotionally unavailable man. Here are 5 clear signs you shouldn't ignore. The behavior of sending mixed signals is one of the most psychologically damaging patterns exhibited by emotionally unavailable men. This hot and cold dynamic isn't random. It taps into a well-documented psychological principle known as intermittent reinforcement, which originates from behavioral psychology. Studies on this phenomenon, particularly those involving reward systems in animals and humans, show that unpredictable rewards create the most powerful attachment. When affection, attention, or validation is given inconsistently, the brain becomes wired to seek more of it, hoping for the next hit of emotional closeness. This pattern becomes neurologically addictive, mimicking the same pathways activated in gambling and substance addiction. The emotionally unavailable man may intermittently offer warmth, deep conversations, or moments of vulnerability that feel incredibly intimate and rare. These brief emotional highs are followed by phases of emotional withdrawal, detachment, or even outright coldness. What makes this cycle so powerful is that the rare positive moments are often misinterpreted as signs of potential or hope. The partner on the receiving end becomes emotionally hooked, continually striving to return to that earlier moment of connection. This not only keeps a partner invested, but also fosters a false sense of progress, even when the overall relationship remains emotionally stagnant. Cognitive dissonance plays a key role in reinforcing the trap. When the behavior of the emotionally unavailable partner doesn't match their words, for example, when they claim to care but act indifferently, the brain seeks to resolve the contradiction by rationalizing their actions. Instead of acknowledging the toxic pattern, the partner might begin to internalize blame. Maybe I'm too needy, or maybe he's just going through a rough time. Over time, these justifications become a psychological crutch, making it harder to see the inconsistency for what it really is: emotional manipulation, even if unintentional. Attachment theory also offers insight into why mixed signals are so effective at keeping someone trapped. Those with anxious attachment styles, shaped by early relationships that were unreliable or inconsistent, are particularly vulnerable. The hot and cold behavior of emotionally unavailable men activates core fears of abandonment and rejection, which increases a drive to cling to the relationship rather than let it go. This creates a loop where the emotionally available partner becomes hyper-focused on fixing the emotional disconnection, often sacrificing their own needs in the process. The trauma bonding that results from this inconsistency can be intense. Trauma bonds occur when the brain associates emotional pain with love due to repeated cycles of hurt and temporary relief. This explains why even after being repeatedly let down, the partner may feel unable to leave, because the relationship's emotional volatility mimics past wounds and keeps them stuck in a cycle of emotional survival. Additionally, the emotionally unavailable man may not even be consciously aware of his pattern. Many struggle with emotional intimacy due to unresolved trauma, avoidant attachment styles, or fear of vulnerability. Instead of confronting these fears, they manage their discomfort by keeping partners at a safe emotional distance, drawing them in just enough to maintain the connection, but not enough to create true intimacy. This behavior keeps both partners trapped in a dynamic that feels passionate, but is ultimately unsustainable and emotionally exhausting. When emotional needs are repeatedly dismissed, minimized, or met with silence in a relationship, it leads to a psychological phenomenon known as emotional invalidation. This occurs frequently with emotionally unavailable men, who often lack the capacity or willingness to engage with emotional expression. When a partner says, "I feel neglected," and the response is, "You're overreacting," or "It's not that serious," the underlying message is that their emotions are illegitimate. According to Dr. John Gottman's research on emotional attunement in relationships, emotional invalidation is a critical predictor of dissatisfaction and long-term disconnect. Partners who feel invalidated stop expressing themselves altogether, not because they don't feel, but because they've been conditioned to believe their feelings are unwelcome. Emotional unavailability is often linked with dismissive avoidant attachment, a style formed during early life experiences where emotional needs were not consistently met by caregivers. As adults, these individuals develop discomfort with emotional intimacy and often respond to emotional expression as a threat to their autonomy. When their partner expresses vulnerability, such as needing reassurance, clarity, or more affection, they may interpret as criticism or emotional pressure. The result is either withdrawal, irritation, or shutdown in communication. For the partner, this repeated cycle creates confusion and self-doubt as they begin to question whether their emotional needs are valid at all. What often follows is a pattern of self-silencing. To preserve the relationship, the partner begins to suppress their feelings and needs, thinking it's the only way to avoid conflict or emotional distancing. Dr. Dana Jack's theory of the silencing the self scale in relationships outlines how women, in particular, tend to quiet their voices and emotional expressions in partnerships where they fear rejection or abandonment. Over time, this emotional suppression doesn't just harm the relationship, it leads to anxiety, resentment, and even depressive symptoms in the suppressed partner. In many cases, the emotionally unavailable man will also use subtle forms of deflection or gaslighting to avoid accountability. For example, when their partner asks for deeper communication or more presence, they may respond with, "You're being too sensitive," or "You always turn everything into drama." These comments not only deflect attention from the issue, but shift blame back on the partner, who may then feel ashamed for even having emotional needs. This form of manipulation, whether conscious or not, reinforces a belief that expressing emotions leads to rejection or ridicule. Moreover, emotional invalidation has biological consequences. Neuroscience research shows that when emotional pain is dismissed or ignored, the brain registers it similarly to physical pain. The anterior cingulate cortex, the same region activated during physical injury, lights up when someone is emotionally excluded or invalidated. This is why emotional neglect, though invisible, can be just as damaging as more overt forms of abuse. The partner's nervous system becomes dysregulated, existing in a state of hypervigilance. Always try and predict emotional withdrawal and avoid triggering further shutdown. The long-term consequence of constantly having to suppress emotions in the presence of an emotionally unavailable man is the internalization of unworthiness. The partner begins to believe they are too much, that their desire for connection is excessive, or that if they were different, quieter, more patient, less emotional, things might improve. This belief system keeps them trapped in a toxic loop, trying to mold themselves into someone who deserves to be loved by someone emotionally unavailable. Feeling lonely while in a relationship is one of the most painful emotional experiences, and is a common reality when involved with an emotionally unavailable man. This phenomenon is often a result of emotional neglect, where one's emotional presence is consistently overlooked or undervalued. According to research by Dr. John Ice Webb, emotional neglect is not about what's done to you, but what is consistently withheld, such as affection, validation, or emotional engagement. In this context, even though the partner is physically present, their inability or unwillingness to connect emotionally creates a pervasive sense of isolation. This disconnection is particularly disorienting because the person experiencing it may not immediately recognize it as a problem. Unlike overt abuse or betrayal, emotional neglect is subtle and invisible. The emotionally unavailable partner may fulfill practical duties, being polite, sharing meals, or coexisting, but remain absent from any form of deep emotional engagement. Over time, this creates a profound inner void. The partner may attempt to initiate conversations about feelings or relationship needs, only to be met with silence, surface-level responses, or redirection to practical topics. This lack of reciprocal vulnerability gradually erodes emotional intimacy. According to attachment theory, humans have a biological drive for closeness and connection. When a partner fails to meet these needs consistently, it activates the brain's threat response system, increasing cortisol levels and triggering emotional stress. In relationships with emotionally unavailable individuals, the unmet need for emotional closeness mimics the psychological effects of rejection, even in the absence of direct hostility. The mind perceives the emotional absence as abandonment, and this can cause chronic anxiety and insecurity in an emotionally available partner. Neuroscience further supports these findings. Studies on social pain by Naomi Eisenberger have shown that the brain processes emotional exclusion or lack of connection in the same way it does physical pain. The dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, which processes physical hurt, is also activated during perceived social rejection or emotional distance. This is why loneliness in a relationship feels so intense. It is not just psychological, but biologically distressing. The lonely partner often begins to question themselves. Why do I feel so empty even when he's here? Or, is it my fault that we're not emotionally close? This confusion is a natural outcome of trying to reconcile the partner's physical presence with their emotional absence. In many cases, the emotionally unavailable man may not even recognize his lack of engagement as a problem, viewing emotional expression as unnecessary or even threatening. For someone with an avoidant attachment style, emotional closeness may feel suffocating, and their instinctive response is to create emotional distance. Over time, the lack of emotional nourishment leads to emotional depletion. The emotionally available partner may feel emotionally starved, craving connection, but too afraid or exhausted to ask for it again. The effort to maintain connection becomes one-sided, and even small moments of affection feel transactional or rare. This imbalance breeds resentment, but it is often suppressed for fear of pushing the partner further away. In this way, loneliness becomes normalized, and the relationship continues in a state of quiet emotional famine, further entrenching the toxic loop. Repeating the same emotional cycles in a relationship with an emotionally unavailable man often reflects a deeper psychological mechanism known as repetition compulsion, a term introduced by Sigmund Freud. This concept refers to the unconscious tendency to recreate unresolved emotional experiences from the past, often rooted in childhood. When a partner continues to engage in familiar yet painful relational patterns, like constantly hoping for change, tolerating neglect, or excusing emotional distance, they may be reenacting old wounds in a subconscious effort to gain control over a narrative that once made them feel powerless. These patterns tend to follow a predictable script. There's an initial phase of hope, often sparked by charm, chemistry, or a brief period of affection, followed by periods of distance detachment or emotional withdrawal. This cycle creates a cognitive loop where the partner keeps rationalizing. He was so open last week. Maybe he'll come back to that. This constant emotional oscillation between connection and disappointment mirrors the intermittent reinforcement pattern identified in behavioral psychology, reinforcing attachment even when the relationship is harmful. The emotionally unavailable man may also engage in cyclical behaviors, disappearing during moment of intimacy, reappearing with vague apologies, or expressing temporary remorse without changing his core behavior. This lack of growth or accountability keeps the relationship stuck. Research in emotionally abusive dynamics has shown that cyclical patterns of rupture and repair, where harm is followed by temporary harmony, can form trauma bonds, making an emotionally available partner increasingly loyal to the cycle, not the person. Attachment theory further explains why such cycles are difficult to escape. People with anxious, preoccupied attachment styles may perceive withdrawal or emotional distancing as a threat to the relationship's survival. This perceived threat triggers hyperactivation of the attachment system, leading them to become more emotionally invested, even as their needs continue to be unmet. The partner may constantly try to fix the relationship, seeking validation or intimacy from someone fundamentally incapable of providing it, which reinforces a feeling of helplessness and dependency. Emotionally unavailable men, particularly those with avoidant attachment styles, may resist emotional depth because it threatens their sense of independence or control. They may prefer surface-level communication, deflect vulnerability, or retreat when intimacy deepens. Their partner, in turn, ends up taking on the emotional labor of the relationship, trying harder, initiating conversations, or suppressing their own needs to maintain connection. This dynamic becomes a loop where emotional imbalance is the norm, not the exception. Therapists often note that when clients describe being stuck in love, what they're often describing is this exact loop, a psychological and emotional circuit that feels simultaneously familiar and painful. Each round of the cycle reinforces the belief that the relationship can improve if they just try harder, wait longer, or change themselves. The painful truth is that the repetition isn't due to bad luck or poor communication, but a deeply ingrained pattern fueled by unmet emotional needs and unresolved trauma. Without conscious recognition and emotional boundaries, this loop can persist indefinitely, draining both emotional energy and self-worth. Walking on eggshells in a relationship with an emotionally unavailable man is often a symptom of chronic emotional unpredictability and a fear-based dynamic. This experience reflects a psychological state where one constantly monitors their words, tone, or needs to avoid upsetting or being abandoned by their partner. It is a behavioral adaptation rooted in relational trauma and is frequently observed in relationships where emotional safety is absent. Over time, this leads to a hypervigilant state of emotional self-regulation, where the partner suppresses their true feelings to maintain peace. One of the key psychological frameworks that explains this behavior is fawning, a trauma response identified alongside fight, flight, and freeze. Fawning occurs when someone tries to appease or please others to avoid conflict or rejection, often at the cost of their own authenticity. In relationships with emotionally unavailable men, the emotionally attuned partner may engage in fawning behaviors, becoming overly agreeable, minimizing their needs, or adapting their identity to avoid being seen as too much. This pattern is particularly common among individuals who experienced inconsistent caregiving in childhood, where love was contingent on compliance or emotional silence. Research on emotional invalidation and avoidance shows that when one partner is unable to handle emotional expression, the other often becomes an emotional caretaker, shouldering the burden of keeping the relationship stable. In this dynamic, asking for clarity, reassurance, or deeper intimacy may be met with irritation, withdrawal, or accusations of being demanding. These reactions condition the partner to avoid bringing up issues, even when something deeply hurts. Over time, this results in emotional gaslighting, where the partner starts doubting their right to feel, react, or express anything that might disrupt the fragile status quo. Neuroscience supports the toll this emotional environment takes on the brain. Chronic stress caused by emotional unpredictability activates the amygdala, the brain's fear center, and dysregulates the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal HPA axis, which governs the stress response. This leads to symptoms such as anxiety, insomnia, fatigue, and irritability. Living in a constant state of emotional hyperawareness, even in the absence of overt conflict, creates long-term psychological strain and undermines one's ability to feel secure and at ease in the relationship. Additionally, walking on eggshells often leads to a distorted sense of self. The partner may begin to internalize the belief that they are overly sensitive, needy, or incapable of maintaining healthy relationships. This internal narrative reinforces shame and self-blame, making it even more difficult to challenge or exit the relationship. According to schema therapy, such patterns often tie back to core emotional wounds, such as abandonment, defectiveness, or unlovability, that drive people to tolerate toxic dynamics in the hope of eventual acceptance. What makes this pattern so damaging is that it erodes emotional authenticity. Over time, the partner loses touch with who they are outside of the relationship. Their voice, values, and emotional reality become muted. This self-erasure, driven by the need for relational survival, leaves lasting emotional scars and reinforces a toxic loop where safety is only achieved through silence and self-sacrifice.